Excellent. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Libby Bischoff. I have the pleasure of being the executive director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at the University of Southern Maine. We are on our Portland campus today on the unceded homelands of the Wabanaki, and we are really excited to be doing what we're calling like a different kind of hybrid, because our Monday Map Lunch presenter, Dick Judd, is actually sitting next to me. And I will be turning it over to Dick in just a second. So it's really nice to have an in-person visitor to the Map Library doing the Map Lunch to all of you tuning in from all over the place. So today's Monday Map Lunch is presented by Dr. Dick Judd, who is my colleague at the University of Maine, the University of Maine System's flagship campus up in Orono, where he was for many years prior to his retirement in, did we decide 2018? 2018. A professor of history focusing on the environment, New England, Maine. He was my fellow Maine historian, and a longtime user of many maps, and a great thinker about both urban and rural spaces throughout the duration of his long career. So Monday Map Lunch gives us a chance to welcome folks talking about new work or works in progress. And this Monday Map Lunch is very much a celebration of a work that was in progress, but is no longer in progress because it is out in the world. So we invited Dick to come and join us today to talk about his new book, Democratic Spaces, Land Preservation in New England, 1850 to 2010. And that came out from the University of Massachusetts Press right around the November-December holidays. So it has been out in the world for about 6 months. We hope you will avail yourself of a copy or check it out from your local library. You're welcome to come and check our copy out at the Osher Map Library. And what Dick chose to focus on today for his presentation to the Monday Map Lunch group is a particular story from the book, really looking at Boston. I'm delighted to see our colleagues from the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library here with us today. This is a very relevant topic to their collections. But today's topic is preserving nature in the heart of Boston from vacant lot to urban wilds. So I'm gonna do a little shifting on this computer to pull the presentation up. We're gonna go ahead and share our screen. Dick will give his presentation, and then we will do a moderated conversation with all of you, and we will be done around 1 o'clock. So thanks again for tuning in and having lunch with us. We're gonna go ahead and share our screen momentarily. I'm going to turn it over to Dick.
Thank you very much, Libby. And I'm very happy to be down here and have someone else work out the details for me. As I told Libby, I retired, as she said, in 2018, which was just before the pandemic. So I'm not, I've never been availed of the blessings of a Zoom lecture like this. So we'll see how it goes. But the title of my talk then is Preserving Nature in the Heart of Boston from Vacant Lot to Urban Wild. And it comes from a book, as Libby said, I just published recently called Democratic Spaces. And my initial intent in this book was to survey various forms of land preservation in New England, from the village improvement societies of the 1850s up into the ecosystem management projects in the northern part of Maine in the 1910s or so. But along the way, I became involved in a project with the Land Trust Alliance, which was looking to deal with a certain image problem that the land trusts have had for the last couple of decades. And that is that, as you see from the image on the book itself, when most people think of preserving land, they think of these nice wilderness areas where you can mostly white middle-class families can go and enjoy nature and things like that. And the Land Trust Alliance was interested in preserving lands that would benefit underserved peoples more than something like this. And this is particularly true in urban areas. So I included a chapter in democratic spaces on the attempts to preserve land in urban areas, in particular in areas that were underserved by parks and other forms of green spaces. So let me begin by just reading a quote from an article which some colleagues and I are hoping will come out in an anthology in a couple of years called either Nearby Nature or Nature in Your Backyard, or something that sort of promotes the connection between nature and where people live. So I'll begin with that quote, a short paragraph, and then I'll go on and explain what all this means. In this manuscript article, I say at the beginning, in a 1994 Boston Globe article, Scott Allen described a recent trip to Ponkapog Pond, a shallow impoundment nestled in the Blue Hills. His AMC guide, Katie Goldfield, explained that the pond was home to more species of dragonflies than any other place in the temperate United States. And for this and other reasons, it was, in her estimate, quote, one of the finest natural wonders in the area. Perhaps, Allen thought, the wonder was not so much the pond's biodiversity, but its location. The buzzing of the dragonflies was barely perceptible over the muffled roar of the traffic passing on nearby on Route 128, where 160,000 harried commuters rush by each day traveling to and from Boston, just 5 miles away. So my argument really is that Allen's article is part of a subtle rethinking of the place of nature in the urban environment. A century earlier, for example, urban progressives had brought nature into the city, basically by creating elaborate landscape parks, but they never really thought of the city itself as an ecology. And this would only come in the 1960s when people like Ian McHarg began thinking about nature, about cities as a natural ecosystem or a fusion of natural and engineered form. Our McHarg would point out that if you have siltation in one area, it would move downstream through that system and clog up other areas of the urban infrastructure. Or pollution in one area might travel down gradient and contaminate areas further away. But on the other hand, gardens, parks, greenways, river walks, and other green settings improve the functioning of the city itself. So that you would have an entire green infrastructure that was absolutely essential to maintaining the city itself. By the 1970s, then, this idea of a hybrid cultural natural ecosystem fell into place, and ecologists began thinking of the city as a single improved, part of the city itself. With multiple benefits. And I just, you can read these for yourself, I won't list them, but by the 1970s, then the idea of a green infrastructure, urban ecology became a very respectable topic for research among ecologists in this area. And probably the most important of these in the urban area was a person by the name of Peter Del Tredici, who worked at the Arnold Arboretum. And he was absolutely fascinated by these trees and plants that came from all over the world, needed no fertilization, needed no irrigation, but they came together as this single dynamic cosmopolitan community where divisions between native and exotic and invasive became totally meaningless in this totally new environment, this totally new ecosystem that made up an important part of an urban environment. So it was in this exciting era of expansion of ecology as a science into the urban area that we see Boston launching this urban wilds movement. And it was very important and very significant that Boston became sort of the birthplace of the urban wilds movement, partly because it had an urban climate, a humid climate, which is very essential for the type of biodiversity in this particular ecology. It had a horticultural tradition that went back centuries. That is, wealthy estate owners in the suburbs of Boston would bring plants from all over the world into this environment, and some of them escape into the city itself, of course. Then it had a legacy of park innovators like Charles Eliot and Frederick Law Olmsted. And for good or ill, it also had an abundance of vacant land. This goes back to the 1950s, for instance, with the textile and the shoe industry collapse of this period, the deindustrialization of much of the core area of Boston itself, the urban outmigration, the middle-class outmigration of the 1960s, left about 1,500 to 2,000 vacant parcels by the 1970s in the major area of Boston itself. That is somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 acres of vacant land. And then, of course, finally in the 1970s, we have the semiconductor revolution in the Boston area, which restores prosperity and leaves Boston open to experiments such as this. So it was in 1974 then that a man by the name of Elliot Roadside, was a landscape architect for the Boston Redevelopment Authority, began surveying. We got a federal grant to survey the city's open spaces. And 2 years later, Boston published the seminal work, it's either a large pamphlet or a small book, I guess, called Boston Urban Wilds, a Natural Area Conservation Program. And what Roadside had found is that there were something like, well over 400 public and private spaces that were suitable for some kind of preservation. And here we use the Boston Redevelopment Authority, who own much of this land, their definition of what an urban wild might be. It's very tentative and very ambiguous definition, but it's a vegetated open space that would offer nearby residents a predominantly natural experience. And this 4,000 acres or so included much private land that was transferred over to the Parks Department or to the Boston Conservation Commission. It also included land that was unavailable for development because of federal wetlands regulations, or they were on steep slopes or quarries or salt marshes or places like that. But the important thing I think about this is that most of this land, excuse me, was in areas that were underserved by parks and recreational facilities. That is, they were in somewhat unwholesome land, riverbanks, wetlands, places like that, that had never attracted developers. But again, were areas that were in neighborhoods that were underserved by any sort of parks in that area. So what, in terms of how this worked, is that the public land was transferred, as I said, to the Conservation Commission or the Department of Parks, or the Department of Conservation Commission, Department of Conservation, Parks Department, places like that. And the private land would be purchased on a set of priorities that included both ecological criteria and social criteria. The ecological criteria would be undisturbed land over 25 acres or more. I don't know how you define undisturbed land in the middle of a city, but there it was. Anything over 25 acres that looked undisturbed, I suppose. Anything that was held observable clues to Boston's geological history or functioning components of the city's green infrastructure. That would be wildlife habitat, water percolation areas, things like that. The social criteria would be land that was threatened by development would be purchased first. Then they would purchase land in low income areas and in areas of high concentrations of elderly and young people. So what we end up with in Boston is this very diverse set of urban wilds that range from anything from a outcrop of rock like this, for instance, which is, I think, pudding stone, to maybe 100-acre woodland or anything in between, quarries, old dumps that have been decommissioned, places like that. All of this was eligible for becoming an urban wild. And in 1977, this was sort of made official when the preservationists put together what was called the Boston Natural Areas Fund. This was in 1977. And this was dedicated to purchasing private land according to the criteria that had been set up in the earlier study. So by the late 1980s, Boston owned something like 220 acres of urban wilds that were accessible to the public. Now, this is an extremely ambiguous project for a variety of reasons. First of all, it included, as I said, everything from forest to a simple outcrop of rocks, maybe half an acre up to 400 or so acres. It could be boulders, it could be ponds, it could be meadows, it could be slopes, it could be ravines, they could be water courses, industrial sites, dumps, old dumps. And you can imagine the different kinds of ecologies that would emerge in each of these very, very different areas. So there's a lot of diversity in what exactly a urban wild actually was. And the ownership was equally confusing and equally ambiguous. Parks Department owned some of the land. The Metropolitan District Commission owned part of the land. Part of the land was owned by schools. Public Health Commission, I think that would be behind hospitals and such, Port Authority, Water and Sewer Commission. So there's a lot of owners for this land in itself. And of course, the management was very mixed as well. City agencies such as these manage some of the areas. The Youth Conservation Corps helped maintain others. Private preservation organizations maintain some of the land, and some were just maintained by neighborhood volunteers. So what I'm suggesting is that designating urban wilds really raised more questions than it provided answers. As I suggested, it was not really clear who was in charge of these areas, and it's not really clear how you designate or how you differentiate a weedy vacant lot or from an urban wild. And remember that these are from diverse neighborhoods as well. Everything from upper middle class neighborhoods in the periphery of Boston to mixed race and impoverished areas in, say, Dorchester and Roxbury and places like that. And that's just a question of how these urban wilds should be managed. Remember that this is an extremely dynamic successional ecology. That is, these lands have been cleared and they're coming back to all sorts of things. What an ecology is one year could be totally different from what it's going to be in the following year. So how do you handle this? Do you eradicate everything but the native species? Do you include invasives in this project? Very, very unclear how this natural area program, this urban wilds, should actually proceed. In spite of these ambiguities, then, the various owners of these urban wilds tried to make an argument to convince the people of Boston that the vacant lot behind their house was actually an urban wild. And the way they did this is to sponsor guided tours of these places, to schedule field trips, school field trips into these areas, sponsor neighborhood cleanup days for the urban wilds. This would involve, in some cases, summer youth programs, or what we call green teams, that is young people being hired over the summer to go in and work with these lands. And in one case, I think it was in Hyde Park, the Parks Department actually rented a herd of goats to come in and clear out the poison ivy, buckthorn, and invasive species like that. I think probably, they're very effective actually, but I think it was more a publicity stunt than it was an actual attempt to manage urban wilds. But nevertheless, over the years between 1977 and the 1990s, people came to accept these urban wilds as a legitimate form of nature experience in an urban setting. And this became so successful. I'm just going to close with a couple of examples of how neighborhoods themselves got involved in this program and began using the urban wilds rhetoric to preserve property land in the area of the neighborhood itself. The first of these is the Hancock Woods, which in, I think it was, let's see, 1990, 1997, I think it is. I can't see from the screen. No, 1995. This is a 46-acre woods, and it was owned privately. And the owners decided they were going to develop a series of apartments in this area. The neighbors became very active. They formed protest groups, and their arguments were basically two. The one, that this was a very important green space in a complex of green spaces. It was an important link between, say, the Charles River, the Fens, and the Arnold Arboretum. It was important to maintain that connection through this area, a wild connection through this area. And also, they pointed out that their children had for generations used this area as a kind of an informal park. After several protests, the developers scaled back their project and turned the rest over to a conservation easement. And you have an urban wilds there, primarily because the neighborhood itself defined what an urban wild was and went forward with actually developing this area themselves. A second example is in East Boston, the area on the other side of the Charles River. This is a, what you see, picture is a former industrial site, a contaminated industrial site, and a group called the Chelsea Creek Action Group, which is actually a coalition of various other groups, got together in 1999 and forced the city to turn this from an abandoned industrial site into an urban wild. Their arguments were basically that this particular area of East Boston was very much below the ratio of green space to number of residents that was standard for the Boston area. And secondly, this was their only access to the waterfront itself. So after hundreds of protests, the city took over the land, and the group itself, the Chelsea Creek Action Group, sponsored a $1.3 million effort to clean up, remediate the area. They had to move tons of lead and arsenic from the area before it could be turned into a green space. But what you have right here is the Condor Street Urban Wild, finally completed in 2003. So what I'm arguing again is that it took the neighborhoods themselves, neighborhood activism itself, to define what an urban wild actually was. And they did it on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. They would get together, they would form neighborhood associations, force the city to purchase or set aside lots, and then fold this land into land preservation effort into a kind of an environmental excuse me, justice campaign. And thus we have basically finally a definition for what an urban wild is on a kind of a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. So let me close just by saying that Boston took the lead in what became kind of a national movement in creating urban wilds all around the country. Just to give you one example, San Francisco now has more green space in acreage and in biodiversity than the whole of Yosemite National Park. This is a very important part of the reconstruction of an urban infrastructure, a natural infrastructure in these urban spaces. So let me just close by reading once again from this article that's going to be coming out in a couple of years in this anthology, just to close this off, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. Living in the Anthropocene means recognizing that we have changed nature everywhere, but the corollary of this understanding is that nature is everywhere. Nature can be remote, abstract, in a spiritual place, or it can be in our own backyard. It is a presence woven into our everyday lives. To embrace this fusion of nature and culture means replacing the romantic vision of wilderness with a more realistic understanding that nature is part of our environment wherever we live, and human activity affects it in one way or another. We need not venture out into the Maine woods like Thoreau to find contact with nature. Rather than waiting to experience nature in the big wild, we can find it in our everyday life. Thank you.
And I get to come back now too and moderate a conversation and take these slides down. Thanks, Dick, for that super generative talk. I would very much invite all of you tuning in this afternoon for lunch with us to put a question in the chat. You are welcome to raise your hand. I'm happy to call on you and you can unmute and ask your question. But while I give you a couple of minutes to get some questions together for what you would like to ask Dick, you know, I spent my first hour of the day today walking in an urban wild, as I do almost every day when I travel from Gorham to Portland. I was at Portland Trails, has an extensive network of urban wilds here in the city. My preferred trail is Jewel Falls on Capissic Street. And I'm reminded of just how important these spaces are to people and what a rediscovery of them there were for so many people during the pandemic, particularly during lockdown, particularly in cities and suburban areas where people could only kind of go outside to meet with one another. And it seemed like everyone I knew, no matter where they were on lockdown, in San Francisco, in Austin, Texas, in Boston, here in Maine, was outside discovering some new to them park or trail just for a sense of escape. And it was interesting, you know, having grown up in Boston in and around Boston in the era that you were talking about today, especially the 90s, early 90s when I was in high school there, how prevalent these campaigns were on the news and how different they seem now. So I'm wondering, in the larger context of what you're arguing in the book and the edited collection, kind of moving forward, you know, looking at this in 2024 and all of the activism that was happening around this from like the 1970s to the 1990s, what's next? More of these? Are they still as much in the forefront of the public imagination, these urban wilds, as they might have been 20 or 30 years ago? Or is it more like the global environmental crises and global warming that's really like occupying people's consciousness? Yeah,
Oh,
you're good.
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Libby. Let me begin by saying that the chapter on urban land preservation really includes more than the urban wilds. It's the public gardens movement, the community gardens movement. It also involves, and this is where maybe your question comes in. It involves affordable housing. That is, there's competition for this vacant space, for gardens, for urban wilds, and for affordable housing, particularly in places like Dorchester and Roxbury, low-income places. What I was seeing towards the end of my research was that the affordable housing movement is really kind of superseding urban wilds. And part of this is to kind of guard against gentrification, that is putting in affordable housing before places like Dorchester becomes gentrified, so that there are places for those residents to live. So there's a lot of competition going on here, and I'm not sure how that's going to play out. Urban gardens, community gardens, sorry, were very important in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. You don't see them so much in the news anymore. So it's hard to say, but I think you're right. I think our environmental consciousness has become more global than it was in the 70s.
Yeah, and the affordable housing argument completely tracks, at least here in Maine, and certainly in our urban areas, and especially in the greater Portland area. That is the local discussion. I mean, there are many, but when you talk about that sort of local land use, it is very much a call for affordable housing, superseding almost everything else. So what other questions do folks have? Feel free to raise your hand and unmute, or just unmute and ask a question, or drop one in the chat. Kind of see everybody here on the screen. So we have a question coming in from Soren. So Soren asks, Dick, do you have any advice or lessons for areas where it seems too late for urban green space? Thinking about Everett or Revere, where houses soak up most every square foot. What's the answer there? Is it ever too late for urban green space?
Yeah, it's incredibly expensive to set aside land in places these days, and the only examples of being successful in totally built up areas like this is I can think of Sanford, I think, in Connecticut. What they did is they took out some dams on their river, and those pools behind the dams are now green space because nobody was developing them there. So I guess you'd have to be really innovative. Opportunity, I think, for those kinds of green spaces.
For those kinds of areas. And it's hard to imagine folks tearing down their houses and then leaving those lots vacant in most cities at the moment.
I don't know how far along deindustrialization has gone in places like that, but that's another possibility. And in a lot of cases, these are decommissioned dumps. A lot of cases, they are where landfills have been, totally filled up and they're covered over. And I remember when I lived in Los Angeles area, we used to go walking and a very beautiful arboretum environment goes on top of gigantic landfill in the, I forget what part of Los Angeles it was, but so, urban areas are incredibly dynamic and there are always opportunities, and I guess you just have to seize them.
So that seems decommissioned landfills, of which there are many in Boston, seems another possibility. Great. We have another question from Maureen. So Maureen, our colleague up in the Lewiston campus, asks, for a few years, I lived near the Back Bay Fens and the Fenway Community Garden and was struck by disabled accessible plots, another access of an aspect of environmental justice. Did you kind of see accessible spaces in all of these areas during this movement? Was that also part of the activism?
I believe so. That's sort of the argument I was trying to make, is that because of the ambiguities in the initial attempt to define what an urban wild was, neighborhoods themselves stepped in. The first thing they would do is go in and clean out the area. And once that had been done, they sort of staked a claim to it. And they could go to the city, if it was city-owned property, and have it transformed into an urban wild, or get the city to maybe purchase it if it was not. In many cases, these are lands that belong to institutions, like hospitals or schools or churches or something like that. And persuasion, these institutions can be give, say, a conservation easement to these lands, and they can be more in service to the neighborhood than to the institution themselves.
Yeah, we've seen some of that here. I think see more of that with walking trails in Maine. And certainly here, where when you think about deindustrialization, where I live in the town of Gorham, a lot of the deindustrialization is really deindustrialization from 19th century industrial spaces.
Yeah.
So like the Shaw Brothers, a local construction company in particular, there was a 19th century gunpowder mill between Windham and Gorham that produced something like 30% of the gunpowder used in all of the Civil War. That is now a public mixed use walking, hiking, biking, interpretive trail that connects Sebago to the sea, part of the Sebago to the Sea network. But it's also right next to the Shaw Brothers, their sand and gravel company in construction, but it's right next to their pits. So like there's been a massive cleanup for that. And what's interesting is that, in 1860, this was like a city, right? This area. And now people walking their dogs there every day or playing softball or down by the Brezomsky River, aside from the historical panels, would have no idea what this is used for. So I think the creativity has really been there and so transformed some of these landscapes that they don't even resemble their use.
Is the Cumberland Canal?
The Cumberland Oxford Canal. It's that whole area. Speaking of deindustrialization. So Rob Sanford, fellow professor emeritus here at USM from Environmental Science and Policy, ask, how much change might we expect from the recent recognition of the severe need for affordable housing? Like, are you going to see the same scale of change that you saw in this, do you think?
Yeah, I think, as I said, this becomes a top priority for vacant lots, unused land right at this point. So it might be that the urban wild movement has sort of reached its maximum.
Because of other pressing issues.
Well, other issues of social justice. I think if it was to put in another supermarket or something like that, it'd be no question. But how do you prioritize, say, low-income housing and urban wilds? That's the real issue. Not so much, development for middle-class people, but how you serve low-income neighborhoods one way or another.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about, as I was listening to you present today, particularly around Boston in the 90s, right? Because this is also so happening in the big amp up to the big dig, right? And happening kind of leading into that. And then the big dig produced a lot, including some green spaces. But it's interesting that like how these issues get totally subsumed underneath other land use and environmental issues in cities.
And you got to remember, Boston is just kind of coming off this, the outmigration of middle-class people, the deindustrialization from the textile industry, the shoe industry, and all this. So there's plenty of open space in the 1970s when this, when this idea arose. Not so much today.
I think the seaport is one of the most glaring examples of that for me. When I lived in Boston, the seaport was like a couple of landings, Jimmy's and Anthony's, Pier 4, a few restaurants, and like vacant lot after vacant lot. It is unrecognizable, and it is mostly high-end condos and high-end shopping and some museums and arts district as well. Like every square inch of land got completely transformed in the scope of 20 plus years to see the city kind of changing its imprint and its footprint in these ways. As you think about this project the book that you just finished and put out now, and the project that you're working about coming forward in this period of your career, I mean, you've done so much for environment, land use, rural versus urban? Like, what are the big questions you're thinking about right now? What's like occupying your thoughts?
Actually, it's a project that I've been thinking about for about 20 years, but I thought, well, this is not academic. I will
That's
wait till
okay,
I
you're
retire.
retired.
Yeah, but it's a history of the future from the 1930s up to the 1930s. And basically, 20 years ago, I was thinking about, now, why are people not taking climate change seriously? Why aren't they really thinking about their children and their grandchildren? So I went back into environmental decade, the 1970s or so. So it's a bizarre project, but
I
I think
love
I've
this
got a lead on
project.
it.
It's how people from the past thought about the future.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
I love
Yeah.
it. We have so much World's Fair stuff that is going to be so useful to
Oh,
you,
yeah, yeah.
particularly
Well,
for the 1930s and 1960s. Like, so much of the 1930s World's Fairs are future forward.
oh, the 1939 New York World's Fair, that was the whole theme. I mean, most World's Fairs are about the technology in the present. But for some reason, in 1939, they were thinking future, the war's coming and the middle of a depression and everything. So they didn't really have a lot to think about in the future. But what's interesting is that in the 1930s, the future was basically an escape from nature. That is, synthesize everything, materials, houses,
Invention of plastics.
plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, all this stuff was how we can transcend nature. And then what's interesting is how that changes from the 60s into the 70s, when nature becomes essential to any idea of the future.
Of the future.
Yeah.
I can't wait for this book. Okay, this is
Mhm.
exciting. We have another question from my
Mhm.
counterpart, Garrett Nelson, at the Boston Public Library, the Leventhal Map Center there. So he writes, earlier movements for urban green space, like the Metropolitan Parks advocacy from the 1890s onward, gave a lot of consideration to questions like how working class people would get to these places, right? With street railways, with trolleys, and how they would be guaranteed enough time to enjoy them, like economic and labor reforms for 8-hour days and 40-hour weeks.
Right.
Any evidence of similar considerations being on the agenda for the 1970s and the urban wild advocates that came after?
Yeah, I forget the study, but there is a study of recreational areas that says that a park is accessible if you don't have to go more than a quarter mile or something like that to get to it. So when Boston began rethinking their urban parks, there was the big parks went into a kind of a remission in the 1950s and 1960s. They built playgrounds, but they're not doing parks anymore. And then this was all revived in the 1970s, a huge investment in green spaces and parks in Boston in the 1970s, along with the urban wilds movement. But the idea then was, okay, so how do we get parks or green spaces of some sort? This would be like river walks and various forms of recreational green space. How do we get them within a quarter mile of all?
So people wouldn't even
citizens?
have to travel to them.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that was the idea. And particularly for immigrant populations who felt uncomfortable about leaving their homes. They would go a block or so down to a park, but they wouldn't go across town to go to, like Fenway or something like that. So that was a big push to try and get some kind of green spaces in each neighborhood, particularly the ones that were underserved, historically underserved. I forget where the question was.
Yeah, and also
Yeah.
economic reform so that people would have the time to enjoy these
Oh,
places.
that, yeah, I really didn't deal with that much. I'm sorry to say. I don't.
So in the 70s and the 80s, it becomes more about getting the parks to the people
Getting
rather than the
parks to
people to the
people.
parks.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah. Mhm.
So we have many expressions of thanks in the chat, and I will ask one more time for questions, and sort of as we're closing up our lunchtime period together. Thinking about being on outside, it'd be a great day to find a place outside in your urban wilds to go take a walk. I think we might hit 70 in Maine for the day for the first time in a very long time. What are some, I mean, I know historians don't always think about these things, but so much of your work deals with actions that people take in their everyday lives to kind of like better the areas that they're in. What motivated all of these advocates in the 70s and 80s? Like, what was really like the driving force behind the urban wilds and so many of these things?
Well, this is kind of an interesting, really fascinating dialectic between city officials and neighborhood activists, because this is the period when we begin to see environmental justice movement starting up. So there's a lot of activism in South Boston, places like that. And they're able to go to the city, to City Hall, and actually get some response from City Hall on these things. So there's a lot of interaction in that way. But I would like to emphasize basically the social justice, the urban activists, primarily who defined what an urban wild was, and then went in their neighborhoods and got these places established. So there's, like I said, it's sort of a fusion of personalities.
Yeah, and really grassroots activism for what individuals' neighborhoods needed, which might look different from South Boston to Dorchester to Roxbury and Brighton and everything in between.
Definitely, yeah.
All right, we will end up with Jim St. Pierre's question. Thanks, Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Thoreau spoke not only about creating national parks, but how each town ought to have a community forest of 500 to 1,000 acres. Wasn't the grassroots movement in Boston that you described using and defending their urban wilds like in that same spirit? Protecting green spaces in cities has many benefits. Diverse parks and other protected spaces can have enormous value, both ecological and social. The social element's really interesting here.
Question?
So was the grassroots movement in Boston also sort of like this? Were they tuned into this? Is it a continuation of the transcendentalists, or was it something else entirely?
Was there a connection? I never really thought about that much. I sort of approached it as this is a totally indigenous movement, as apart from the land trust movement outside of this. But there were some connections to major land trusts. The trust, the Boston or the Massachusetts
Trustees of the Reservations.
Trustees of Reservations now owns a good chunk of the urban wilds and the community forests. It's the largest landowner of recreational lands in Boston today. So they're really on board. And trustees for years and years and years had this long quote, the very one that Jim was using there, long quote from Thoreau in their you open up the annual report and there's Thoreau. So from Thoreau to the land trust to the to the urban wilds movement, I think there is a continuum there.
Great, thank you. Well, that continuum is a nice place to end our lunch together. So thank you everybody for tuning in today. Hope you get some time to go out and explore your own urban wilds. And thanks so much to Dick for coming down to Portland and joining us for Monday Mad Lunch.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.